since 2005, the implementation, it looks like it's about $825,000 this project saved over not having to do lease lines, not having to pay the providers, not having to pay the vendors. And that was just based on the project as it was initially scoped out. When we actually put it in, we doubled the number of endpoints, and we're still doing more. So if I look at what had happened, maybe say we had 30 endpoints out there, that would have been $1.6 million that they could have saved from this whole project. And it doesn't quantify any of the costs from the extra add-ons, the scope creep, all the other things that we had on the project. And there was also a request to have any endpoint actually become an initiator of the conversation, which would have jacked up the initial price as well from the original plan. So far, we're averaging around 400 minutes a month of actual talk time on the system. If we took out all the whoops calls from hours and hours of silence. I've got it installed in about 14 generating sites throughout Florida, and it's their primary means of communication for their dispatch. And they used to even do weekly test calls to make sure everybody was near the phones, could hear the phones, hadn't turned down the volume. And they recently went just to monthlies because it's been going so well, and they haven't had any problems after everybody got a little more accustomed to the system and the setup. And that's all I've got about that. Do I have any questions that I can answer? Yes, sir. It's a good question. The question is, during the hurricanes, do we have the internet go down? And the answer to that is yes, but not at as many locations as the, well, let me rephrase that a little bit. The problem was that folks didn't know how to get back and communicate back to each of the different sites. So they may have had a phone number, but if nobody was at that phone or what have you, then it was more difficult for them. Part of the other objective of this project was to be able to take that phone and move it somewhere else onto a different location, just plug it in and go. Somebody got a temporary internet connection back up. It's much quicker for them to fix those problems than it was to try to reroute calls or have failover in a small city, stuff like that just didn't work too well for them. So even though this would not survive as a primary means of communication in an emergency, it definitely makes it easier for them to do things in your day-to-day operations. Because everything is done, all my IP tables on my Asterisk hosts are written to a specific IP that I know the originator. I know where it's coming from. We haven't had any problems at all, but the system is also completely closed off. All the endpoints can only talk to the endpoints. There is no ability to talk to the PSTN or anything else. So even if somebody were to somehow get in behind one of the IPs that I trust and register themselves, all they could do is talk to the other endpoints on the system. It's right now, it could be, but because I haven't seen any use on the backup server, we haven't dedicated a whole lot of resources to doing replication. So essentially what I do now is I'll just, and the endpoints don't change that often either, so there's not a lot of changes going on. So we'll just do a backup of one and dump that onto the other one manually. I could automate it, but it's so little use it doesn't make a whole lot of sense at this point in time. This was really a proposed solution. I heard a lot of the folks talking about what they were trying to do in the office, and I was just commenting about how silly it was to spend all that money on something that didn't need to be spent, and that raised a few eyebrows. And then I came up with this whole way of doing it, and they didn't even believe that it could be done, let alone put out in 2 weeks from the day that they said, yeah, let's do it. So. So the question is there any regret from management from going with this system over proprietary? There have been issues, but those every single time we've looked into the issue, it's been at the entities. They have a problem with their network. They've had a problem with somebody changed the firewall and they didn't know that this other thing was behind and they weren't allowing that traffic out. So those have been all the issues that we've dealt with are along those same lines. Those folks were, of course, not happy not being able to communicate with those endpoints. But once they figured out what was going on, they understood. And the other thing that they found was the original vendor, it was a Sprint MPLS setup. They were not happy with the response time they were getting from Sprint on their own stuff. And they would put in a call, and it wouldn't even be answered for weeks or months on end. And we were figuring out just in a couple of hours where the problem was, fixing it, and moving on. So there has been no regret. There have been small issues, but certainly no regret, especially when you got a possible over $1 million cost savings. That makes up for a lot of other issues. So. Gotcha. So the question is, why didn't we use this off-the-shelf telephones? Off-the-shelf phones would require like an FXS type dial tone delivered to them, and that would require more pieces and parts to be deployed out to the end sites. So then they would have to have the network. Then they would have to have power something to something to power the gateway and then the endpoint itself. Plus, I didn't see a whole lot of stuff out there that would allow me to just automatically turn on the endpoint in a page type scenario. So that's why we went with the Astra phones. Folks could use PoE if they so chose, so they didn't even have to run the power supplies and stuff like that. And a lot of the folks understood, at least on a basic level, VoIP. So when we gave them to them, they kind of understood what was going on with it. So. Okay, so the other question is, have we put in any specialized monitoring tools to look in and notify when units go offline? And right now we don't. Right now I deliver the page externally on a website that certain people can get to that'll actually show the registration of the different endpoints. So if they have trouble communicating with one, they may look at that and see if they're actually registered or not. And then they may have to call them on the phone and say, hey, why is your phone offline? Is your internet down or something like that? But that's rare. Probably if we had a lot more problems, or if this became like a real-time type, all the time on communication, I would definitely do that. But I'd probably be moving into MPLS if I was really concerned about the quality control and all that stuff over the internet. So.